guess a little prelude to today's sermon is that you're going to hear a lot of dates, and that doesn't mean that you need to try to remember all the dates, but if you can just notice the pattern that they show. So for a period of about 20 years, a large group of friends and I would gather together every 4th of July weekend and most Labor Day weekends at the cabin of one of those friends. The cabin was in a town called Freedom, Maine, a perfect place to celebrate Independence Day. And we all called the pond by which the cabin sat Freedom Pond, although it was officially known by the more mundane name of Sandy Pond. On most of those July weekends, there were about 30 of us. The Labor Day gatherings tended to be a little smaller, 18 or 20 maybe. You might wonder how 30 of us could fit in that tiny cabin, and you'd be right to wonder. Other than Bonnie and John or Vass, Chris and Ann, and a few others who slept on sleeping bags and the cabin floor, we slept in tents that we pitched in various places in the woods surrounding the cabin. Vass usually got the fire in the fire pit going early in the morning and was in charge of cooking breakfast for most of us. Eggs, pancakes, bacon, coffee, except for the few who opted for cereal and milk. After cleanup, the morning was spent in the pond, swimming, kayaking, canoeing, playing. In the afternoon, we'd walk to a nearby field where we'd set up a volleyball net and play on teams that we made up on the spot. Later, some of us might play basketball in the driveway of Bonnie's brother's home, which was just a short walk away. And most of us took part in the yearly softball game on Freedom Field, a Little League park, where the snack shack never seemed to be open. When the rains came, we gathered in the cabin or under a tarp and played board games or card games. Bonnie called us the Rainbow Family, but Lorenza called us her tribe. I liked that term. It seemed to catch on. Most of us, I think, referred to this group of friends as our tribe. We got together at other times of the year as well. Large Thanksgiving Day gatherings, get-togethers on Bonnie's late January birthday, where we'd break up into teams and compete in a treasure hunt, driving from spot to spot around Boston and Cambridge, after which we'd gather for a meal and ice cream. It was great to feel part of a tribe. At Camp Rainbow, we'd all pitch in with chores, whether it was taking responsibility for a meal, gathering firewood, putting up a tarp over the picnic tables in the case of rain. We banded together. Though certain folks took leadership of projects, no one asserted authority over another. We were an egalitarian tribe, or so we considered ourselves. There's no one official consensus concerning the word tribe except the most general. It's a human social group. The anthropological definition is based on understanding of social and kinship structures. But as these vary from culture to culture, the more anthropologists learn, the less they're able to come to agreement on what constitutes a tribe. In some cases, tribes have legal recognition and some degree of political autonomy from the national or federal government, Wikipedia says, but this legalistic usage of the term may conflict with anthropological understandings. So I guess it's clear that when I talk about our group at Freedom Pond, I'm using a loose definition of the term, one based as much on how we feel when we're together as on any dictionary definition. There were families who were part of our tribe, and couples, and single people. There were folks in their 60s and 70s, and 3- and 4-year-olds. Most of us were white, but some of us were African American. Most of us were American born, but Lorenza was from Mexico, which is America too, now that I think of it. Some of us were straight, some of us were lesbian. We were a heterogeneous tribe. One of the characteristics of tribes is social solidarity or ideological solidarity. We certainly had the former. Undoubtedly, we had a lot of the latter as well. Many worked in the labor movement in one way or another for one period of time or another. Most of us worked in human services, social workers, classroom teachers, hospital workers, university professors. One lawyer, one doula, 2 medical translators, a principal in a school for the arts. There was no test for ideological purity, of course, but we were quite comfortable talking politics because we were all in general agreement that the progressive path promised the best hope for equal rights and social harmony. The social solidarity, that was an unmitigated good thing. The ideological solidarity was fine too, as long as we did not have to engage with relations with a different tribe with significantly different ideological solidarity, which we never had to. But that brings me to the issue that concerns us today. I tend to think of it as tribalism, or political tribalism. But as I looked more deeply into the issue in preparation for this sermon, I came to believe that the most appropriate term is tribal bigotry. Bigotry, obstinate or intolerant devotion to one's own opinions and prejudices. Devotion, that's a nice word. What are you devoted to, do you think? Most of us are devoted to our families, I bet. I hope that most of the time we're devoted to our friends. Many here are devoted to their church. Are we devoted to our opinions? Or do we hold our opinions lightly, knowing that they don't define us, that when circumstances change or new knowledge emerges, we have flexible enough, expansive enough imaginations to accommodate the changes? Are we devoted to our prejudices? Or do we see them as what they are? Obstacles to enlightenment, obstacles to understanding. Things that provide a soothing defense against unpleasant or difficult truths. Things that allow us to luxuriate in our bitterness, our distrust, our hatred even. Prejudices make us ugly if we cling too tightly to them. They make us merely human if we hold them lightly. It's best if we don't pretend they're not there. Tribal bigotry. Bigotry based not on an individual feeling of one's own superiority, but the belief held as tightly as a creed that one's tribe, however defined, is superior to the other tribes, and so must emerge victorious over them. How empty that goal. How dangerous that scale of values. We are deeply divided as a country, but historically there have always been divisions. We emerged as a self-declared independent nation in 1776. In 1789, our Constitution established us as a federal democratic republic, an indivisible union of 50 sovereign states. Of course, we found out how unreliable that term indivisible is when the war between the states broke out. We declare ourselves a democracy because people govern themselves. We are representative because ideally people choose elected officials by free and secret ballot. But there has always been a tension between honoring the sovereignty of states and the primacy of federal government. Because we are a democracy, we are free to elect our representatives. But who votes in these elections? The Constitution recognizes that the states have the power to set their own voting requirements. In most states, the requirement for voting was that you must be an adult white male. From the start, women and people of color were disenfranchised. A few states, though, allowed free black men to vote. And New Jersey also included unmarried and widowed women as long as they owned property. That was in 1789. In 1791, Vermont was admitted as a state and gave the right to vote to all men, regardless of color or property ownership. A year later, in 1792, Kentucky was admitted as a new state and gave the vote to free men regardless of color or property ownership. A free black man could vote in Kentucky in 1792. That right was shortly taken away, though. In 1807, the voting rights that had been given to free black men and all women aged 18 years earlier was taken away. I wonder why. Might it have anything to do with white men seeing themselves as a tribe and wanting to preserve the power for making weighty decisions for themselves, to empower themselves? Is that perhaps tribal bigotry? In 1821, Native Americans controlled large territories in upstate New York, but they were excluded from voting entirely. The 1828 presidential election was the first in which non-property holding white males could vote in the majority of states. Also in 1828, Maryland passed a law to allow Jews to vote. Maryland was the last state to remove religious restrictions for voting. Until then, being Jewish was also a reason to be disempowered. Do you think that had anything to do with tribal bigotry? Most states at some time in their history insisted that property ownership was a necessary qualification for voting. So much rewarding of privilege, so much disenfranchisement. In some states, only white men could vote. In many of the states that once allowed free black men to vote, that right was taken away. Women gained rights in some states, lost rights in others. In 1841, Thomas Wilson Dorr led a rebellion in Rhode Island because men who did not own land could not vote. 2 years later, the state drafted a new constitution allowing all free men the right to vote, whether they owned property or not, but they had to fight for it. In 1856, 67 years after the United States Constitution was established, North Carolina became the last state to abolish property qualification. The biggest change, the most significant change in voting rights in the 19th century occurred in 1870, when the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was passed. It prevented states from denying the right to vote on grounds of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Almost immediately, successful efforts of disenfranchisement began. According to the article on the timeline of voting rights in the United States on the online encyclopedia Wikipedia, former Confederate states passed Jim Crow laws and amendments to effectively disenfranchise African American and poor white voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and other restrictions applied in a discriminatory manner. During this period, the Supreme Court generally upheld state efforts to discriminate against racial minorities. Only later, in the 20th century, were these laws ruled unconstitutional. Black males in northern states could vote, but the majority of African Americans lived in the South. In 1876, Native Americans were ruled non-citizens and ineligible to vote by the Supreme Court. In 1882, Chinese Americans lost the right to vote and to become citizens by the Chinese Exclusion Act. A pattern has established itself. Persons who are not of the majority tribe are seen as inferior and as a threat. Those persons cannot put their faith in the court system, even the Supreme Court, to grant them full rights and equal treatment. Not always, anyway. As the 19th century turned to the 20th, though, state after state granted women the right to vote, most of them in the Midwest, the Far West, and the Southwest. In 1913, women and white and African American women were given the right to vote in the territory of Alaska. Finally, in 1920, after many an editorial, many a protest, many a demonstration, many an arrest, women were granted the right to vote by a passage of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. But I remember, 40 years later, when I was a child and doing my best to learn the rules and the mores of the adult world, the discussions in the neighborhood and around dinner tables concerning women's voting habits. Shouldn't they go along with their husband's opinion? As after all, he was the head of the household and should not have his vote canceled out. Four years after the historic decision that gave women the right to vote, in 1924, all Native Americans are granted citizenship and the right to vote through an Indian Citizenship Act. Now, did that guarantee the right to vote? Not necessarily. Some Western states continued to bar Native Americans from voting until 1957. South Dakota refused to follow the law at all. Tribal bigotry is alive and well in the United States. Attempts to contravene the rights of certain citizens to vote continue through gerrymandering, redistricting measures, through literacy tests, through demanding picture identification cards from the people least likely to have them. People who have committed felony offenses and have served their time, can we refer to them as ex-felons, are prohibited from voting in 10 states and have to petition for the right to vote in others. Only in 1986 were members of the United States military serving overseas or living on bases in the United States or aboard ship were granted the right to vote by the Uniformed and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voters Act. To review, because we are a democracy, we are free to elect our representatives. But who votes in these elections? The Constitution recognizes that the states have the power to set voting requirements. If history teaches us anything on this subject, it is that the right to vote confers power on the individual voter, so much so that there will always be someone who will try to wrest it away if that voter is not a member of the majority tribe. There will always be people who identify not just as an individual who happens to live in a certain state, have particular beliefs, and desire to vote for particular candidates based on those beliefs. There will always be a tendency to think of ourselves as members of a tribe whose interests are aligned, whose fears are shared, whose prejudices are reinforced by those seeking power through a strategy of divide and conquer. There will always be tribal bigotry. How can it be combated? The efforts of this church to participate in a postcard writing campaign designed to encourage voting by those who feel marginalized and disempowered is one way. Anything that encourages participation among those who are so often systematically excluded is a step in the right direction. Any conversation with someone whose politics are different from yours will provide a chance for communication and an exchange of views. Even if neither party is persuaded to change their position, each has an opportunity to educate the other. We all have become too aware, though, that much of the political partisanship we encounter these days is so firmly rooted in emotions such as fear and distrust that well-reasoned conversation does not have a chance to make an impact. A conversation, there may be an opportunity for a meta-conversation, though. A conversation which explores the history of the right to vote in the United States and in the various states. A conversation about tribes and tribalism and the human tendency to band together and to see other bands as threats. A conversation that admits that we all hold prejudices, but we don't need to let them define us. One of our two major political parties in the United States has shown an alarming tendency to justify conspiracies to obstruct fair elections and to subvert the results of fair elections with unsubstantiated charges of election fraud at the polls, even to justify a violent attack on the United States Capitol as an expression of free speech. And people of goodwill in that party have condemned those acts, called out the perpetrators, written books, and been subjects of interviews that have condemned those acts. So it can be done. The best thing we can do is to educate ourselves, prepare ourselves for difficult and contentious conversations, and spread the word about the dangers of tribal bigotry.